in the public debate today topic, and we immediately responded positively because we believe these meetings between academia and institutions such as Conselho das Finanças Públicas are very important, mutually beneficial, I would say, but certainly beneficial for the academia, and also for the quality of the public debate and ultimately for the quality of public policy. So my first word would be to Professor Nazaré Costa Cabral and Conselho de Finanças Públicas for the challenge that you addressed us and the opportunity to work jointly on preparation of this seminar. So thank you for that. I would also like to thank all the participants and in the audience and the speakers, and of course, in particular, Professor Charles Viplos, Professor Josh Kopitz, and Professor Paul de Groot. It's a pleasure to have you here. Sorry that you can't be with us really physically in Porto, but I'm sure that other opportunities will follow. So thank you very much, all of you, and I hope this is, and I'm sure it will be an excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor José Varejão, for your kind words and also for this enthusiastic way that you welcomed this initiative of the CFP. In fact, this is the third conference of a cycle of conferences that we have launched this year for the first time. And the idea is to, together with academia, with the Portuguese universities, to discuss issues that we, the CFP, consider that are crucial for the comprehension of the economic and fiscal situation of the country. Our first conference took place in March. It was with the University of Coimbra, the Faculty of Economics, and then in October we had already, due to the circumstances, a webinar with Nova School of Business and Economics from Lisbon. And now with Porto, it is a pleasure to close this first session of this cycle with Porto, in a way also to hear and to understand the opinion of important academics, important scholars, their work, because I think that the CFP work has a lot to benefit from the contributions that can come from academia. On the other hand, the decision to close this first cycle with this topic, with the topic of fiscal rules, which is more a topic on the domain of public finances, I think that the decision to choose this topic is mostly due, first of all, because we are facing a severe crisis. And of course, this severe crisis will have impact not only in economic, but also in fiscal terms. The discussion about fiscal rules in the European Union, in particular in the monetary union, was something that was being done already before the crisis. But I think that now with the crisis, the topic has become even more necessary, more urgent. We know that in the end of the crisis, one of the consequences of this crisis is that countries will become highly indebted, and the countries that were already highly indebted will become even more highly indebted. So this is a source of concern for us as an independent fiscal institution. The way possibly fiscal rules can be redesigned or at least rethought, and nothing better than to listen to the experts, to listen to the scholars, to the academics that have studied and discussed this issue before. And so we are very interested. I think that this is a very promising session, and we are very interested to know and to see which will be the outcome of this discussion today. So once again, thank you. Thank you for your welcome. Thank you for the presence of the participants from the University of Porto, Professora Maria Manuel Pinho and Álvaro Guiar, and also to thank the presence of my colleagues, Professor Jorge Kopitz and Paul de Grau and Carlos Marinheiro, that will do the closing session. And firstly, last but not least, on the contrary, to thank the presence of Professor Charles Viplotz, that in a very kind way has accepted to be here with us today. So the session will start precisely with the lecture that will be made by Professor Charles Viplotz. Thank you very much.
For the sake of the audience, and although I'm quite convinced that they know about you, because you're also the author of some well-known textbooks, and some people studied here from your textbooks. Professor Charles Viplotz, Professeur Charles Viplotz, il est français. He's French nationality, but works in Switzerland, and I guess I'm not sure, but I guess he's now speaking to us from Geneva, from somewhere in Switzerland. Although you were always all very excited about all coming to Porto, and I have to thank the Faculdade de Economia do Porto, because as always they are so kind to host all kinds of scientific events. Thank you, José Varjão, and all the Porto colleagues. We know that Charles Viplotz, from his work in INSEAD, at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, he published extensively on economics, regional monetary integration, and so we were very, very pleased, and we will be attentive to what you're going to tell us about this important subject. At the end, people from this distinguished audience will have the opportunity to have some questions to Charles Viplotz, and I would ask them to write those questions either to me or to Helena Rua, and then or directly to Charles, why not? And then probably we could have some time to have some kind of discussion before entering the first panel. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Miguel, and thank you to the Fiscal Policy Council. I can't pronounce that in Spanish, for inviting me. I'm always delighted to discuss with Fiscal Policy Council for two reasons. One, I've been, I think, pretty early in the literature advising the setting up of Fiscal Policy Councils. So anytime one has been created, I saw it as some sort of a personal victory. I must say George Kopitz, who is here, was ahead of me on that. But I think we were fellow travelers in this story, and things have happened. Second, I'm very keen to talk to Fiscal Policy Councils, because I think they have to play a much larger role as we go forward in improving our frameworks in the European Monetary Union, and it will come clear through my talk. So, having said that, let me share my screen so I have a PowerPoint presentation that you can see. So, what I'm trying to present are ideas which I've been pursuing over the years about what should the proper fiscal rule be, and not originally, several others have already said it has to be simple, it has to be flexible, and it has to be enforced or binding. And let me now get straight into that. Now, the state of play, so I'm only going to talk about the euro area. So the state of play in the euro area is that we now have had 22 years of Stability and Growth Pact, and it has failed, and it has failed repeatedly. Let me just show this, because I'll be arguing a lot about public debts. Although the pact has tended to emphasize the budget deficit rule, it has a public debt rule, and I think what is right is a public debt rule. I explained that in a minute. Not a 60% public debt rule, but some public debt rule. I try to be clear about that. Now here I've put in blue the evolution of public debt as percent of GDP in the euro area. The euro area has been changing, the composition has been changing, and this is reflected in the data that I use. And as you can see, on average, the area was never down to 60%. It has been at flat for the first 10 years or so, and then with the great financial crisis, public debts went up and up, a little bit down, and more recently up. I'll come back on the COVID crisis in a minute. You will see also in orange at the bottom the average public debt of the countries with the three lowest public debts. So composition is changing over time, not only the membership in the euro area, but also which are the three lowest, but you'll systematically find Estonia and Luxembourg. And on top, you have the gray. In gray, you have the average public debt in the countries which have the highest public debt every year. And again, composition has been changing, but you'll find almost all the time Greece and Italy. Now, what I think is interesting is that if you look at the what I call the virtuous countries in the orange at the bottom, you will see that they have no debt problem or fiscal discipline problem, as I like better to call it. Their debts have gone down during most of the period until this year. They have been up during the financial crisis and up again during the euro debt crisis, but they basically have no fiscal discipline problem. And they started from lower than the average, so they were fiscally disciplined before joining the euro area. They have been fiscally disciplined ever since then. On top, you have the gray countries, and it's the exact opposite image. They started higher than the average, and they were supposed to go down according to the pact, and they never really went down. It was sort of stable during the first 10 years, and then up and up with the two crises that I mentioned. So we have a failure of the pact in the sense that it was useless for the virtuous countries, and I didn't want to put an adjective on the other countries, so I call them less virtuous countries. And on the other side, it had no effect on the countries that need it. So it was unable to impose fiscal discipline on the countries that were fiscally undisciplined to start with. The last point I want to make, because it will come in a minute, is you see the uptick, which is for 2020. These are the forecasts of the European Commission. I think the uptick is going to end up much bigger than what the Commission is forecasting, if only because we now have the second wave that is making the situation even worse. Now, what I find amazing is that if you compare the uptick of the virtuous countries of the euro area as a whole and of the less virtuous countries, you see the uptick is bigger in the less virtuous countries. Maybe because they are not virtuous, or maybe because they need more of an uptick. And I don't know, and I think this is an interesting question that I haven't pursued, but it's an important question. So the Stability Pact didn't spread virtue, and the unmistakable conclusion is that these countries which have not been fiscally disciplined, it has to be rooted in their national institutions. It's not in the genes or the DNA. There is something in these countries that leads to lack of discipline. And of course, the pact hasn't been able to deal with that. Now we know the pact is suspended until end of 2021. So I applaud the Commission to very quickly suspend it, initially till the end of this year, till now, and then they extended to 1 year. That was a good idea. And it gives us time to think. what happens at the end of 2021. Are we going to back to the old system? And I ideally hope not, but I'm not sure. I believe it's not going to happen. The pact has failed, and it will fail again and again because it doesn't deal with what it should be dealing. There have been many reforms of the pact over the years, which I call tinkering, and they failed. They didn't improve the situation, as the picture I showed you before. So it's not just that we need another of the reforms we have had where we're going to add this or that, change a little bit. It's just the whole concept of the pact that's wrong. Now, why can't I? Strange. Sorry. Good. Now, why has the pact failed? First, because it's a complex construction. We have the deficit objective, the debt objective. Then they added all sorts of things like expenditure objective, preventive and corrective arms, and then provision for reforming countries. So now it's well acknowledged it is so big, so impossible to understand that it can't really work because of that. And because of all these objectives are inconsistent. So you can, most countries can satisfy one or two of them, but not all of them at the same time. And that's, of course, used to evade the constraints. Second, in the complexity, it is quantitative. So we have the 3%, the 60%. These are numbers that were never justified, that have been invented at the start, and are arbitrary, and arbitrary constraints cannot be enforced because they are arbitrary. On top of that, it's the same numbers for all countries, and the picture that I showed you earlier should be enough to convince you, I hope, that the constraints cannot be the same if they are quantitative for every country. And the result of this complexity and these arbitrary numbers is that in the end, the pact has become very much a political thing where there have been no sanctions, and there was always some political reason for that. I never forget, being French, of course, is that when France violated 2 or 3 years ago the pact, the answer from the commission or the commissioner was asked, why is France escaping scot-free? And the answer is because it is France. A good example of bad politics. There's also a lack. So a second reason why it's failed is there is a lack of clarity in its construction. The pact never really defines what is fiscal discipline. It should be about fiscal discipline, so we don't have any strong underpinnings, I would say theoretical underpinnings. And it's also overlooking the dimension. So the pact is a year-by-year thing. Over the time, they have started to look at all the way up to 3 years, whereas, as I will argue, the fiscal discipline is not a question of 1 to 3 years. It's a question of 10, 20 years, in theory, infinity of years. Now, of course, infinity is too complicated for us mortals, but focusing on the next 3 years just makes no sense, and there is hardly any discussion on that. Finally, the enforcement is impossible because at the end of all this discussion, fiscal policy is a national prerogative, so there is no way we can force a democratically elected government to do something that it doesn't want to do with its fiscal policy. So there are sanctions, but sanctions cannot be really enforced. So there's no enforcement mechanism. And the reason why we need a fiscal discipline framework is that there is an externality, and we saw that with the debt crisis, Greece, etc. One country's misbehaving fiscally has impact on the whole of the union, and then it's even the crisis can be spreading That's something that you know pretty well in Portugal from 2010-11. So there's no clear treatment of the externality. The pact is supposed to be the treatment of the externality, but it's not built to do that because it doesn't have the tools. Now, what is the link with COVID? Because that's, I think, the theme of today's seminar. Well, I think Professor Nazaré Cabral already said what I am going to say very briefly then. We are now in a historical crisis, sanitary crisis, and all countries actually will need to support the recovery. Now they have to support the crisis, and when it's over, we need to make sure we have a solid recovery coming. But the needs of each country will be different from the others. It's already clear in the picture before that the deficits of this year are going to be bigger in the higher debt countries and smaller in the lower debt countries. So it's not a uniform recovery need that we will face. And there's a risk that early return of the Stability Pact, by early I mean by the end of 2021, will be a remake of the austerity policies that were enforced in 2010 and that led to a second dip in growth rate and I believe a number of the political problems we have seen throughout Europe. The good news now is that R is smaller than G, so the interest rate is smaller than the growth rate. It's been a popular discussion over the last year or so. This situation means that the deficit constraint is lifted for all practical purposes for the time being. This is well known, but we don't know how long we will have R smaller than G. And the fiscal discipline, again, as I said before, it's not a year-by-year story, it's a long-term story. So if there is a possibility that R is going to be larger than G in the future, we don't know, but it is a possibility. So there is a big risk when the inequality tilts. So what we need to think about our debt path, not the budget deficit this year or next year, but where could the public debts go in each and every country. Let me mention two things that I will not be talking about. We will exit the COVID crisis with excessive debts. And this is something that it would be very relevant to deal with, a major challenge, but I'm not going to discuss it further. I already wrote some papers on that, but I leave it. Now, monetary policy represents another challenge for fiscal policies, and I won't discuss it either, just to say that if the central bank, the ECB, needs to raise the interest rates, the sustainability condition can turn around very ugly very quickly. So that's part of this R minus G discussion. So anyway, the conclusion is that we are now in much worse situation that we were at the end of the debt crisis in Europe, and much worse than we were when the euro was created and the Stability Pact was invented or put in place. Now, let me outline what I think should a good fiscal discipline rule should be. First, there is one thing that I think we learned long ago, is that if you have one instrument, you can have one objective, and you have to be clear about what is the objective, what is the instrument. I know with uncertainty, it's more complicated, but I'll leave uncertainty out. It's very important, and we have to think about it, and some people have produced good work on that, but let me keep it simple. So what the objectives should be, and my claim for years and years, is that we need a clear theory about what is fiscal discipline. And our theory is I think, beyond controversy. Discipline is about where the debt will be in the long run. And in the long run, in theory, as I said, it's in infinite of times, or something that approximates the infinity of time, like 10, 20 years. We can discuss that. It's a detail at this stage. So the objective has to be debt, public debt in the long term. I'll get you the instrument in a second. So what that means is that any rule should be based on a target for the debt GDP ratio specified for a faraway horizon. And I wrote here at least 10 years, but I think it would be better to go further. All the other criteria that we have right now in the Stability Pact should just be forgotten. And the budget balance, which is now one objective, should be recognized. It's the instrument. It's through the budget balance that we move debt in the long run. This is all extremely simple, trivial, but it's not in the Stability Pact. So that's why I insist on that. Otherwise, I don't think there is much to disagree here. When there are deviations from the objectives, or from going to the objective, that happens all the time. It's the rule rather than the exceptions, because there are shocks all the time. It should not be a problem. It shouldn't get people running up and down the stairs in Brussels, starting to discuss is that this country is violating the pact or not. These are things that happen. They are mundane events. The only thing that is important is that correction must be for sure, which is not what we have in the Stability Pact. So the structure of the rule should make sure correction will happen. And the instrument, the budget balance, is not this year's budget balance, but the whole path over future budget balances until the end of the horizon, 10 years, 20 years, what have you. That's the instrument we should use. Now, in terms of enforcing, the rule, what I call the rules of engagement, have to be compatible with the treaty. The treaty says that fiscal policy is a national responsibility, and therefore the rule has to be enforced nationally at the national level. It should be recognized as a national responsibility. But of course, there is an externality, and the externality must be explicitly recognized and built in. So not through sanctions that will never come from Brussels, but through the rule itself. Now, in terms of flexibility, okay, I already said the prevailing conditions that drives the debt over time have changed over the lifetime of the Stability Pact, and they will change again. That's the world we live in. Unfortunately, we are never in the steady state. Now, what it means is that if you have a long run debt target, the objective, the possible budget balances from this year until the end of the horizon will have to change accordingly. So, given the long-term target, the changes in the prevailing conditions will mean that the path itself will be changing. Even if the government is doing well right now, if R minus G is changing or something else is happening, like a crisis, then the possible path to the long-run debt will be changing. And it's not an accident that they change. It must be built in the rule that the path that are chosen at the moment of time are not forever. They will change during the lifetime until we get to the objective. In fact, there is an infinity of possible paths that takes any country's debt from one level today to the long run level. And it's important to recognize that it's not only one possible path. So like cut your budget deficit by 0.5% of GDP, like the Stability Pact wants us to do. There are many, many ways of going there. And all you have to do in the rule is to recognize there are many paths and to choose one of them. Arbitrarily, it's a political choice. It's for the government. It's not for the Commission or for the Council, the Fiscal Policy Council, to choose it, but I'll get back to that. Now, choosing another path should always be possible governments come and go, so there can be a new government that's elected and wants another path. The government has the democratic authority to do that. What it should not change easily is the debt target. So bygones are not bygones. Now, how about the long-term target? Well, one can argue that there are two things that can happen to the long-term target. First, the 10-year or 20-year horizon is going to have to move every year. Because every year we get, unfortunately, 1 year older, so the horizon has to move around. So normally you should move the horizon, but not change the debt target. But there could be good reasons to change the debt target. For example, an epidemic that comes around and sort of throws everything up, then you need to change the target, but it should be a formal decision, hopefully made by the national parliament. So I see nothing wrong now for Portugal to say, well, we were thinking about going to that level of debt GDP. After what happened over the last 9 months, it's going to be another one, go to parliament and have a formal decision. That's what I call flexibility, because it has to be factored in. Shocks happen. Now, the rule has to be, I come to the end of my talk, the rule has to be binding, and it has to be binding in two different ways. At the national level, it should be in the constitution. We had a reform of the Stability Pact 2000, I forgot when, 12, when there was a suggestion that each country should adopt a fiscal rule of some sort. They called it the golden rule, and that it should be enshrined in some legislation, but it was imprecise. Some countries did put it in the constitution, some put it at a lower level. There is no discussion that fiscal discipline has to be a constitutional, at the constitutional level, and it has to be written very clearly. Now, if the government doesn't meet the debt rules, because it's in the constitution, then the government fiscal law should be referred to the highest court of the country, which would just have to say the government respects or doesn't respect its constitutional duty. And that's a strong enforcement mechanism. There is no 100% safe enforcement mechanism. So if you want to push me on that, I already concede you can never be sure of anything in politics. But it's got to be very hard to cheat with the constitution mandated rule. As I mentioned, the parliament has to approve the debt target, and it should also approve the admissible path that the government has chosen. So different governments that succeed each other can aim for another path, but this has to be a formal act. So it makes it more difficult to change. Now, as I said before, if I want to aim, say, to 100% debt target in 20 years, say for Portugal, there are an infinite number of ways to get there, but it is not for the government to map out this admissible path. It should be given to the independent fiscal council. So I think the council has, every council in every country should be given the monopoly of saying what is acceptable or should be admissible, and the government should be bound by the rule to choose within this infinity of admissible path. If there are slippages along the way, new admissible path could be accepted from the set of paths continuously identified by the Fiscal Policy Council, but the debt target should not be changed unless there is a formal determination. So that's at the national level, that's where most of the enforcement has to take place because it's a constitutional act. Now there is an externality, so we need to have something at the European level. Each country wants to make sure that the others are not going to cheat on fiscal discipline. Otherwise, we have another debt crisis. So in my view, there are three necessary conditions to deal with externality. The national arrangements that are written in the Constitution must be, before they are accepted, must be validated by the European Fiscal Council. We already have a Fiscal Council. It is very small. It has almost no power except from discussing. So we have to have a true European Fiscal Council that is given the authority of telling a government what you're planning to write in the Constitution or what you already have in the Constitution from the past is not good enough. And this is what we want to be changed. The debt targets and the admissible path proposed by the National Fiscal Council should also be validated by the European Fiscal Council. When I say validated, there are very many ways of doing that, and I don't want to go into details at this stage. We can discuss it, but there has to be a step where the revamped European Fiscal Council tells not the Portuguese Fiscal Council, because you're doing serious work, but the Fiscal Council of another country, say France, what you have computed is just not right. Do it again. And finally, if there is no agreement on this level, then the European Fiscal Council should be allowed to seize the European Court of Justice and say this country, well, say France, is not respecting their own fiscal rule as studied by at the European level. So there is an appeal to the highest court on the European Union, which dominates national courts. Now, in conclusion, very quickly, what I am suggesting is probably would require a new treaty, because there would be a requirement for the national arrangements put in the Constitution, or improved if they are there, or installed if they are not there. And the European Fiscal Council should have its mandate extended very strongly, as I explained, and the enabling of the European Court of Justice all of this would probably require a new treaty. So I can already see many of you raising their eyes to the sky and say, not going to happen. Maybe, but as an academic, I'm not a politician. I don't think I want to accept this kind of explanation, saying it's impossible politically as a valid explanation. This explanation has been given over time, continuously, about the Stability Pact. Anytime I talk to policymakers or the Commission and say the Stability Pact doesn't work and won't work, people said, yes, you are right, but we can't change it for political reasons. The result has been plain to see. The costs to societies are huge, and I don't think we should condone that. Now, what about the Stability and Growth Pact? For some countries, it's a fetish, and there is no problem. It can be kept alongside the new fiscal rule if it's easier to get there politically. Anyway, it was never binding. I see it as essentially a bureaucratic exercise where numbers are sent from national level to Brussels, and there are discussions about Brussels, but nothing much happened. Now, what is extremely important, and that's the end, is that National Fiscal Council should have a monopoly on the admissible fiscal path. They are the professionals, the non-political, they should be if they are not, which is the case in some countries, but they should be professionals, non-partisan professionals that can compute this fiscal path and can be trusted. And the National Fiscal Council should be the national watchdogs of what's going on, which they already are, but they should operate under scrutiny by the European Fiscal Council. So when they are under pressure to not really say what they should be saying, they should be caught by the European Fiscal Council. I'm stopping here, and I'm ready for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'd like to have some questions. I have one question myself. I know that Luis Viana has a question for you, and I wonder if other people have some questions. I'm just mine. I have the following question. This concerns your proposal. Suppose we have a 10-year target for public debt, and I didn't understand it very well. If every year you're going to have a 10-year target for public debt, then doesn't that mean that you're somehow defining the path for public debt in 10 years' time? Aren't we just postponing the path problem? How would you deal with that? Arrive to that year in 10 years, then we'll have either we have the public debt that we were supposed to have or not, and then we would have to follow the target for the coming years, which would have been decided some time ago.
Right.
How would you deal with this?
No, this is a very no. This is a very good question. Suppose Portugal decides that you want to bring the public debt, say, to 90% of GDP.
90% in 10 years time.
Not 19, 90.
No, 90, yes. Just to make things credible, okay.
Right. So there are a number of possible paths to go there, and the government choose one and say, my deficit this year and next year and so on and so forth will be such that it will lead me to the 90%. Now, after 1 year, the horizon has shrunk.
Yes.
So either you keep the 9-year horizon and you say, well, we are following the path, or if we didn't follow the path, we have now to do something more. That looks good. After 8 years, it's getting closer. Now, my concern if when you get closer and closer, and if you haven't been there, the whole construction becomes useless. Now, you are absolutely right. If we keep the 90% target pushed every year by 1 year, we reduce the ambition unless we change the debt target. But if you think 90% is good and the country is making progress in this direction, then it's okay to you will get there, or at least in the right direction. Now, when you get closer to that, then it will be natural, and that's what I didn't say, and it's sort of a bet on my part, and I'm not completely sure what I'm going to say. But when you get closer and you are about to reach this target, then there will be a discussion of in the country about lowering the target. So after 5 years, the Fiscal Council would say, okay, we are doing well, we're getting there. Now, as we push 1 more year, maybe we have to change the debt target. Now, maybe it is naive, but you put your finger on an important issue that may need to be refined. That's why, well, let me stop here.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions. So I would ask Luis Viana to please.
Hello everyone. Thanks, Charles, for your great presentation. My question is related to you said that debt is the indicator that you should use on evaluating fiscal discipline. My question is, why do you think that net worth, so assets minus liability, so the balance sheet approach, net worth is a proper indicator to evaluate fiscal discipline, or debt is a better one, and why? So why net worth?
If I understand well, you point out the difference between gross and net debt. Is that right?
Yes, and also to use a comprehensive balance sheet, so net worth from a complete balance sheet as an indicator of fiscal resilience, fiscal discipline, like let's say countries that prepare a consolidated balance sheet, like New Zealand, they use the net worth as a operational fiscal indicator. So do you think we should also discuss why not use a more comprehensive indicator as the indicators from a balance sheet on a consolidated basis?
You're absolutely right, and I've been hiding that, but I knew it would come up. The correct target should be the net public debt. That's what the theory says. when we write the intertemporal budget constraint, it's the real debt. The problem is that, of course, it is very hard to compute a lot of the government assets. Now, I'm glad you mentioned New Zealand. They do it, and I've been talking with our fiscal counsel, and they claim that it's not too bad. They don't claim that it's right, but they claim they have a good handle on it. So that's why I left it open. If you, fiscal counsel, you think you can reasonably well measure the net public debt, then that's what I would have. In many countries, I think it's extremely difficult, especially when government owns a lot of businesses which are public services and so on and so forth, the value of which cannot be estimated properly. In that case, I would use the gross debt. Now, how bad is that? I'm not too worried because financial crises, well, debt crises concern the gross debt. So the instruments that are on the market, that's where the crises occur, and that's where the runs occur when people try to get rid of the gross debt. So in a way, the gross debt is a good indicator of the fragility of the balance sheet, because this thing can disappear in no time. So that's my justification for saying if you can't measure accurately the real debt, go for the nominal debt, and it's not too much of a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question from Carlos Marinheiro from CFP, and I would ask Carlos to explain what he has in mind.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, which I mostly agree with. And I was wondering, which changes do you envisage for the European Fiscal Board in order to fulfill the role that you are thinking for it? Because nowadays it is an advisory role to the Commission, and it is nominated directly by the European Commission. So it could not be seen as a truly independent fiscal institution, contrary to national ones.
Right. So the European Fiscal Council is a great deception, not because of the individuals who are there. There are some very, very good people, but as you say, they are just part of the Commission. They don't have resources, and whatever resources they have come from the Commission. So they are not truly independent. In my mind, the European Fiscal Council would be like National Fiscal Council, an independent institution whose independence is warranted by the Constitution, of people who are chosen for their competence and have the resources to carry out their responsibilities. So it would not be the current setup we have. It would have to be transformed completely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we don't have any more questions, then we go directly into panel one, and we title "What have you learned for the road ahead?" And we now have George Kopitz and Maria Manuel Pinho. George Kopitz is a member of the CFP Senior Board. He's a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and he has a very extensive experience. He served also as the first chair of the Fiscal Council in Hungary, and as he was telling me, he worked 29 years at the IMF, including some visits to this country, Portugal, where he saw some graffiti on the walls, which I will not reproduce. George will be accompanied by Maria Manuel Pinho. Maria Manuel Pinho holds a PhD in economics from the Economics and Management School at Porto, the university and the faculty that is hosting this seminar, and where you were supposed to be actually in physical terms. She lectures macroeconomics, public economics, public choice courses. He's a researcher at the Center for Economics and Finance. and which is something which is important for this matter. She also works at the Statistics Portugal, the National Institute for Statistics of Portugal, INE, in the Public Accounts Unit. They will talk to us now, and at the end also we'll have some time for questions. Thank you both for coming and for being there. Please.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, but not as much as being in Porto, although we have a sunny day in Virginia this morning. So good morning from Virginia. And let me get into the subject matter itself. We have some overlaps with Charles, so I can make my presentation briefer, a little bit briefer than his, or that otherwise would be the case. And just to start with, the way I plan to approach these remarks is by talking about the overall collective picture and perspective of the EU, and then getting down to the national level, particularly at the enforcement or the application of the rules. So let me just try to share the screen. And to do that, I suppose I have to get to the screen. Am I doing the right thing? So I try to approach the issue of rules and then fiscal space from the perspective of crisis management. But basically, it has to do with the mitigation of the impact of the economic impact of shocks, particularly exogenous shocks. So the question, of course, from the collective perspective is how to reform the EU fiscal rules. And then from the national perspective is how to improve compliance with the given rules, whether they're national rules or EU or the EU's Stability and Growth Pact. Okay. Now, I don't think I need to elaborate on the weaknesses of the Stability and Growth Pact, which have been dealt with by Charles. Certainly, it's the most complex worldwide. And as an indication of that, just look at the vademecum issued by the European Commission every 2 or 3 years. The latest one has actually moved towards simplicity by making this vademecum only 100 pages, down from about 200 pages 3 years ago. So that's a step forward. Let's be optimistic, okay? There has been a considerable deterioration in transparency, especially after all the recent revisions. And we see that the enforcement has been totally ineffective and quite inconsistent. The non-compliance, which Hans-Werner Sinn documented about 110 or 20 up until 2018, have never been sanctioned. And of course, he excludes the occasions when a waiver was applicable. So that's 117 country year observations. The no bailout clause has been violated, at least in spirit and implicitly, by the European Central Bank. This has quite a history, but certainly with the quantitative easing, countries have nothing to fear about sanctions on the part of the markets, which are really the sanctions that governments take seriously. The Commission, since that ominous year 2003, 2004 has become political, it should have been really technical, particularly the ECFIN part. But since the violation of the excess deficit procedure by Germany and France, it has become increasingly political, and former President Juncker actually expressed it in no uncertain term at the beginning of his own term that the Commission needs to be political, when in fact it's the Council that should be the political austerity, and the Commission should be really a more technical, as it is by some commissioners, like the one for competition, for example, and so that, but there are others as well. The council, on the other hand, was supposed to exercise a peer review instead of it exercise peer protection, starting in 2003, particularly, when in fact we know it's an open secret that the Italian finance minister encouraged the French and the Germans not to worry, that they would not raise any objections and they would not approve any sanctions. That's history. I happen to have dwelt into these issues from a work that I did commissioned by the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF a few years back. So what are the major options that I see? And these are spelled out in some detail in work that I did for the European Parliament and presented at a hearing of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs almost exactly a year ago, actually. And there are a number of references at the end that can be consulted. This is one of them. It has been published by the European Parliament. I see three options between marginal and radical. And there are sort of it's not too far from what Charles described, but in greater detail. Really, the marginal one is simply a consolidation of the structural balance and the medium-term objective with the debt reduction rule, where there is a path actually for the debt reduction over a 20-year period. Is it 20 years or 10 years? Now I'm a little bit lost on that, but anyway, I think it's 20 years. The debt ratio reduction over that period, which of course is sensible, but it's really a marginal change that is not, it's not really an aggressive one, which I would favor, and that's the innovative option I would call the operational debt rule. Incidentally, the consolidation of the SB and the debt reduction we can find in the case of the former Brazilian rule. I believe Sweden also had that. But the innovative one links the operational variable to the reduction over time, pre-announced period, over as many years as it might deem necessary. The real operational rule, which is really under the control of the finance minister at any time, is the discretionary component of the budget. Okay, so this is basically the discretionary deficit, if you wish, which can be linked, and it has been done, to the ultimate debt rule, the debt ratio target. It's inspired really by the earlier US pay-as-you-go rule, and also by what we tried to do in Hungary over a 2-year period. It was actually in the law, and we moved in that direction. But it's actually all spelled out. It's clear, transparent, because it is necessary to really link a concrete operational real-time rule in nominal terms, okay, which the finance minister, the budget director, has control over, okay, to the ultimate debt target. And then the radical one is the market-based approach, okay, and that's inspired really by, or could be quite similar to the Canadian, US, Swiss approach, where the various subnational governments establish their own rules, or no rules at all, okay? So it's left totally to them, and they are, of course, exposed to market pressures. So it's a market-based approach, and the sanctions can be quite real, okay? It's really the case of California, if you wish. The markets established or put enough pressure by increasing the CDS spread at one time, about 10 years ago, to about 400 basis points, which is what Greece had at the time before they lost total access to the markets in Greece. But it's really an application, a clear application of the no bailout clause, which is enshrined in the Treaty of Maastricht. Now to this, I would add the need, and that's in light of the latest crisis, which is the COVID crisis, an EU-wide fiscal stabilization facility, okay, on a permanent basis to help mitigate exogenous shocks that cannot be totally dealt with or even partially dealt with by national governments. And that's spelled out in another paper just published by the Center of Economic Studies in Munich, which I wrote with my colleague Roel Betsma. And you can find that also in the, it has just been published last week, actually. You can find it in the references. Now let me move towards the issue of improving compliance at the national level, okay? What has been absolutely clear from the very beginning of the birth of the Stability and Growth Pact and its application, including for entry into the euro area, okay? The ones that we are all familiar with, I believe even in Portugal, the accumulation of expenditure arrears, which happen under cash-based accounting, that certainly contributed to the fiscal crisis in Portugal. The impounding of expenditure, cativação in Portuguese, is still really being resorted by governments in Portugal and other countries as well. I should note here that is what really constrained the activities of Richard Nixon in 1974 under the Budget Act of 1974, which actually led to the establishment of the US Congressional Budget Office. And in fact, it's no longer possible here to have that impounding, although the current president, is still president, US president, has really abused and violated this particular issue, particular limit. And then you have suppressed deficits, very popular all over where there are fiscal rules, to meet the ceilings, okay, whatever they are, but say on the deficit, budget deficit, recourse to improvised measures, okay? And we are all familiar with a wage freeze, with even in the case of the very beginning, the entry of Italy into the euro area was facilitated by a refundable tax. Okay, it was called a refundable tax, which was a tax that was supposed to be, and it was then abolished after Italy successfully met the budget deficit ceiling to actually enter the euro area on just political basis. The misreporting of macro fiscal data is really no longer applicable. I have that in just very light gray. Here, Greece, of course, is the famous case, but now that Eurostat is in charge of surveillance, effective surveillance of macro fiscal data, you know, that's out of the picture in the euro area. What this actually, what all these deficiencies really arise from was the narrowing of fiscal space. So let's just briefly look at what this fiscal space is all about. And there is an index which was developed to measure the lack of fiscal democracy in real time by Eugene Sterling from the Urban Institute here in Washington on the basis of CBO data, where you measure the difference between tax revenue and mandatory expenditure. So that gives you a sense of the room for discretionary fiscal policy under some constraint. It could be a balanced budget constraint if you wish. The room for discretionary fiscal policy, again, that a Minister of Finance or a one-year budget provides for the Minister of Finance, and that is in real time. Okay? And this is to be distinguished from the assessment of a more longer term assessment, a more comprehensive assessment, if you wish, of fiscal space, defined as the ability of government to actually raise spending or lower taxes without endangering market access and debt sustainability. You have the IMF reference there if you are interested on this topic. It's a little bit more complicated and more data with need for greater data. But let me illustrate here what I have in mind with the index of fiscal space, where we take the revenues, which are of course permanent, mandatory, unless it's changed by reform, and the mandatory government expenditures. It could be Social Security spending, the interest rate, the interest bill, et cetera, as a ratio of GDP. And we see this illustration. In fact, there are only two countries that I know of where this has been calculated. One of the is the U.S., where we can see since 1962 the narrowing of fiscal space, and now I have this red arrow pointing down, which has been really going into the negative, particularly, I think, given the so-called tax reform of 2017, and likely to go even further down, okay, into the negative area. And there we have Germany, the cyclically adjusted fiscal space. In this case, there has been a continuous decline, but then it's picking up. It's picking up partly because of the debt brake that was imposed, and as well as the impact of some of the labor legislation reforms that took place about a decade, or had the effect shown about a decade ago. So in terms of improving compliance, I think we should try to look for some areas that would widen the fiscal space, okay, and the ability of governments to fulfill their commitments, whether it's a constitution or just a government commitment, to fulfill that with some ease. And what we see is that, first of all, there is need to improve public financial management in some areas, like introduction of accrual-based accounting, which would make it more difficult to accumulate arrears or impounding expenditures. And this should be complemented with periodic expenditure reviews, of course. Highly useful, as shown, for example, at one time in the UK, but other countries as well that conduct such reviews. The Netherlands, for example, I believe Sweden as well, and then estimate and project the fiscal space index to see how much room ahead of time, to see how much room there is over the medium term to comply with the rule or just with the government commitment. Incidentally, I beg to differ with Charles in two respects. One of them is that if the rule is simply long-term debt, which can become, of course, a moving target over time, reminds me of what the Italians say, and which is applicable, and it would be probably interpreted as such by Italian readers when they say chi va piano va sano e lontano, and then the cynic will add ma non arriva mai. For those of you who know some basic Italian, you recognize that whoever goes slowly will get there eventually, healthy and in the long run. But then the cynic will say, but we'll never arrive actually. But anyway, the other area is that the Constitution is important. The Constitution, in my mind, is not really important to enshrine fiscal rules. It could be just a government commitment. Okay, it doesn't even have to be a law. It can be the government commitment that we saw in Estonia, Chile, Sweden, followed quite successfully, and some other countries, the virtuous ones, right? And then you have countries where it's enshrined in the Constitution in big bold letters, and it's totally abused and not complied with at all. So I mean, the Constitution is not really the key, I don't think, from what I see in international experience. And then comes, of course, which has become really by now a foul word in some parts in Europe, structural reforms. Okay, structural reforms is what you need to widen fiscal space. In taxation, shift to less distortionary taxes, broaden tax bases. Don't try to increase marginal rates. That's not really the best way of doing it. But certainly a more productive tax system, particularly by broadening effective tax base, should be helpful in this regard. Expenditure programs, wherever possible, subsidies, for example, should be enacted with sunset provisions so that you don't have really then a clientele behind the particular subsidy program that will want to make such subsidies when they are no longer operational. They want to have them made absolutely permanent into the infinity. Social entitlements towards cost effectiveness, targeted social safety nets, for example, are very helpful. But social entitlements, like a public pension system, which was designed, say, 70 years ago, when the mortality rate was far lower, are no longer adequate today. So that needs to be certainly changed. I mean, you know, again, the Swedish example, the Swedish pension system is really the template that countries should try to follow in this regard to widen fiscal space. And then finally, well, the benefits from widening fiscal space, it affords much greater policy flexibility, including the quick mobilization of fiscal resources to cope with a shock, the type of shock that we are experiencing right now. The scope for expansionary counter-cyclical stance increases, okay, with greater fiscal space. And then you have greater room actually for underfunded expenditures or expenditures for underfunded tasks like education, healthcare, infrastructure investment projects, well-targeted social safety nets, and we could go on and on. Regaining and maintaining public debt sustainability certainly can be very much helped by a wider fiscal space. And finally, enhance transparency and policy credibility, because just by doing gimmicks around the targets and the ceilings, as we know from Goodhart's law, which says, well, when a particular numerical target or ceiling is established, then the performance variable or that performance indicator is no longer credible, and it is gamed by the authorities, as we all know.
Thank you very much, George. I will give the screen and sound to Maria Manuel Pinho. Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start by thanking both Conselho das Finanças Públicas and FEP for this joint organization, and of course for the opportunity to be a part of this event. I will share some slides, very synthetic slides. I hope you can see them. Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay. So my main comment goes to the main topic of the event, in the sense that the question is no longer whether we need fiscal rules, but we need them, both for national independence, but also for the survival of the European Union and the Monetary Union, as long as these rules are well designed and they allow for the proper working of both the automatic stabilizers and some degree of discretionary fiscal policy, which is a key element in a democracy. But now focusing on the specific topic of this event, regarding what we have learned for the road ahead, I decided to organize some thoughts on three main dimensions. And these are that we need good institutions, good data, and good communication. As for good institutions, my main argument here is that despite most of the literature and the discussion, as we have just seen, is highly focused on numerical fiscal rules, there is this other set of both procedures, behaviors, entities that contribute to fiscal discipline, so they can be included in this broader view of fiscal rules. And I would like to address three examples, starting with the budgeting method. The common practice around the world and in Europe as well is to, when preparing the budget for the next year, take the previous budget and making just some refinements, some adjustments at the margin. And of course, this creates a certain persistence, some inertia, because there are spending items that may no longer be needed and keep on being included in the state budget. There is this other method, the zero-based budget method, which requires that every governmental unit properly justifies and prioritizes every spending claim, which of course leads to more efficiency in this process of public accounts. Why isn't this a common practice? Because of course the zero-based budget is a much more complex method. It requires more paperwork and it's more time demanding. So it has the easiest ways to adopt an incrementalist way to go. In the Portuguese case, we have this superior law that guides the fiscal framework, and back in 2011 a set of articles were included in the law, leading to this principle of zero-based budget. But surprisingly, later on in 2015, the law was adapted to the European fiscal framework, and the mentioning to the zero-based budget completely disappeared from the law. And in Portugal, this claim for a zero-based budget has been brought to the table by both left-wing parties and right-wing parties. So at least theoretically, it would be a welcome reform in the Portuguese fiscal framework. Of course, this can be a gradual, it doesn't have to be a radical change, it can be a gradual process. The changes in the way the budget is prepared can be limited to certain governmental units, for example, starting with just public corporations, or limiting it to certain spending items. So I think it's an issue that could be brought back to the discussion for the future. Then some more curiosity that the literature discusses later on in this budgetary process, the internal working of the government cabinet, with this tension between the finance minister and the line ministers, which the literature calls the spending ministers. With this idea that the finance minister has this main goal of keeping public accounts sound, while the line ministers try to maximize their own budget, the health budget, the education budget, and so on. So there are ways to keep this tension more balanced, either by assigning more power to the finance minister, or something that is not really done, for example, in Portugal, which is making the line ministers more accountable for their own budget. Or as an external condition, for example, limiting the number of ministers and leaving some flexibility to the lower level of the junior ministers. So again, this is something that could be discussed. As for a successful lesson from the past that I think is here to stay, concerns the independent fiscal institutions, which were already mentioned here today, which have become a common practice across Europe. As it was already mentioned here, European Commission calls them fiscal watchdogs, nicely, I assume. They have this variety of tasks that range from monitoring to forecasting to promoting fiscal transparency. And so in a strict sense, as in Portugal, we include the Conselho das Finanças Públicas, of course. In a broader sense, we can also include the technical unit within the Parliament and the Court of Auditors as well. But I think this is a successful lesson that is here for the post-COVID era, and it is important that they have the proper resources to perform well. Now, mentioning the second idea, the need for good data, my main argument here is that quality data is the input for numerical fiscal rules. So we cannot have effective numerical fiscal rules if we don't have quality data. And over the recent decades and under this European integration process, the statistical infrastructures of member states have improved significantly under the supervision of Eurostat, with this detailed and demanding system of national accounts. But my point here is that national data compilers keep on being faced with new challenges. So this is not a static process, it's a dynamic one. And just to give some examples, in the aftermath of the recent global economic and financial crisis, member states were asked to provide detailed information on the financial sector. So they had to be prepared to release this data specifically on the financial sector. And currently, with the pandemic days we live in, member states are asked to almost in real time provide data on the impact of the pandemic on the public balance. And this is a two-way challenge, because if we look through the expenditure side, it requires that national compilers are able to properly isolate which spending items are due to the pandemic and which are not. And this alone is not necessarily easy. But when it comes to the revenue channel, this is even more demanding, because what's at stake is estimating the loss in revenue. And of course, it's much more difficult if we want to estimate a non-effective recording. And this will be a challenge for the near future, having reliable estimation of the impact of the pandemic on public accounts. And finally, for the future, we can expect then sustainability issues will become a priority within the European fiscal framework. So probably member states will be asked to isolate what is green investment from the rest of the investment. So again, the statistical infrastructure must be prepared to comply with these requests. So much like the independent fiscal institutions, also the statistical institutions need to have the proper resources to contribute to this fiscal framework. My final idea goes to the need for good communication. It was already addressed here today, the need to have simple and transparent fiscal rules. And the European integration process has, in the search of a more flexibility, has become more and more complex. But if both the national and the European authorities want to get everybody on board with the European integration process, both scholars, policymakers, citizens, they need to communicate well fiscal rules. So I would like to give the example of the structural balance. For those who are not that familiar, the structural balance implies removing from the nominal balance the effect of the economic cycle and the effect of one-off measures. When it comes to the cyclically adjusted balance, there are different, it is an estimation, it's not an observable fiscal aggregate. So there are different methodologies on calculating the cyclically adjusted balance. International relevant institutions use different methodologies, OECD, IMF, the European Commission, and this alone brings some instability to the process. But of course, we know that the relevant institution to us is the European Commission methodology. But the fact is that it is almost impossible to replicate the calculation of the cyclically adjusted balance by the European Commission. It involves the estimation of a production function and the use of elasticities of the different expenditure and revenue items with regard to the cycle. And the analysis of these expenditures alone would be of interest to scholars. So it would be nice to have this information released in a organized way. And the problem is even stronger the challenge is even higher when it comes to the one-off measures. Whether a fiscal measure qualifies as one-off measure or not is up to the decision of European Commission experts. So this alone creates a certain degree of subjectivity in the process. Of course, they are guided by a set of guiding principles, 5 guiding principles, which are somewhat conflicting. And so this is not an objective procedure. At this level, it would be interesting to have a comprehensive database listing all the fiscal measures that have qualified as one-off measures in the European Union for the past years, with the proper explanation of why they were classified as such, the guiding principles that were on the basis of that classification. And only with that comprehensive database could we properly analyze this fiscal aggregate. The Conselho das Finanças Públicas does its own work by providing analysis of one-off measures in the reports, but of course it also lacks the input data that comes from the European Commission that we should have access to. Of course, one-off measures will be in the post-COVID era an important issue, because we can imagine that there will be a lot of fiscal measures that will potentially qualify as one-off measures. So I think this is something that the European authorities could invest on, making this a more transparent process. So I will conclude. I think I made it clear that my idea is that there are, besides the traditional focus on numerical fiscal rules, there is a sort of other dimensions which can be tackled if we want to assess the European fiscal framework. And of course, these are just some examples, but I think I made this point clear of the need to tackle different dimensions. So I finish. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Maria Manuel. Thank you very much. Thank you, George. We now have some time for questions, but I don't have any question with me now. I've got one question from Nazaré Cabral, another question from Charles Viplos. Please, Nazaré and Charles. Nazaré, please.
Thank you. I would like just to make a comment on what Professor Maria Manuel Pinho has mentioned about, first of all, I really I agree with her thought when she claims that we'd also need good institutions, not just numerical rules, but good institutions. And I agree with her idea that in a way, the budgeting method, the budgeting model is not indifferent, because we can see that there are some budgeting models that are more friendly to fiscal discipline than others. And the fact is that we have evolved from line item models that are very much input-based models to other types of models, output-based models. I think that the zero-based budgeting was one experienced. It is a fact that it was abandoned by the law in 2015. The fact is that it was felt as very difficult to make it operational. But the idea of the law was to evolve to a performance budgeting model, which is also an output-based model, in order to reinforce the approach for objectives, outcomes, outputs and outcomes of fiscal policies, a model of programming that intended to be also much more cost effective and to allow for some assessment of the cost of the measures to be implemented within all the public policies. So I fully agree. I think that this would be a very important step in our system to evolve to this, to the implementation, to the full implementation of this performance-based budgeting. Unfortunately, the process has been delayed, and the CFP has, in several occasions, insisted in this need to reinforce the full implementation of this change that the budgetary framework law introduced in Portugal. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazaré. I will ask now Charles Viplos to speak, and then for a reaction of Maria and or George.
Thank you. I have well, a general comment on what Maria Manuel and Nazaré said. There is no discussion that procedures are very important. And I think that's one reason why we need really independent fiscal council, so they can see through whatever government is doing. George mentioned New Zealand. New Zealand, they don't have a fiscal council, they have a treasury. But the treasury is completely independent from government. So they cook the numbers, they make the proposals, and they are the one holding the number. And I think that's what should be the case. It's a little bit the British case as well, or the Swedish case, I forgot which one, where the council is cooking the numbers. So that's right. I have two small comments, slightly critical about what George said. I'm not sure if I heard him say that the institutions are not crucial. I think it's all about institutions, and that's what I tried to show with my initial figures. It's always the same countries that are fiscally disciplined and always the others that are not fiscally disciplined. And that's a question about the institutions, which go beyond the fiscal rule, as Maria Manuel mentioned, the way the government function, the role of the prime minister, the structure of the government, all of these things matter. Now, I don't think at the European level we can fix political institutions in each and every member countries. That's why I believe, as an economist, that incentives work. If you have good fiscal policy institutions, the governments will have to adapt and get better. And many of the things that Maria Manuel were actually the long list that George presented about better taxation, better fiscal expenditure rules. That is, in my view, endogenous to a good fiscal rule. Well, governments respond to incentives like everybody else, and national institutions could be transformed. Now, the last point is about fiscal space. Much of what I said, I didn't mention it, is related to a paper I wrote on fiscal rules. Anytime you fiscal space, sorry, anytime you try to measure a fiscal space, you have to look at the next 10, 20, infinite number of years. The margin of error is just huge. In recent years, the IMF has started to do stochastic DSA, debt stability analysis, which is a step forward. I have a paper, which is a CPR working paper, where I describe what I call today fiscal path, namely recognizing that you can't forecast R, you can't forecast G, you can't forecast growth. You can't measure, as Maria Manuel said, cyclically adjusted budget. So what you have to do, and what I propose in my fiscal rule paper, is that you show what's going to happen to the debt under a large number of assumptions, not trying to put probabilities on them like the IMF does, because again, the IMF reduces everything to one graph with a margin of error, but providing a large number of sensitivity tests saying if R is going to change, if G is going to change, what this is going to happen. And when you do that for any country, you have all these what I call the admissible fiscal path. You have a large number of them. It's for the governments to choose, but we as technicians, we can say, under such and such and such assumptions, which must be completely explicit, this is a feasible path, rather than having one index of fiscal space, and that's my last word. Having one index or one measure of fiscal space, you're going to get it wrong. The probability that you've made the right assumptions to get there is epsilon, because there are so many assumptions going far back in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now ask both George and Manuel for a reaction, and I would ask them to be brief if possible, because it's a bit late, and also after their reaction we will have an interval, but a shorter interval than we were thinking about 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, please, starting by George and then Maria. George?
Yes. No, I think I didn't pronounce my words correctly, and it could be the distance. I have absolutely no problem with institutions. In fact, the course I teach at the Central European University, this graduate course, the title of it is Macroeconomic Policies and Institutions. And institutions is precisely what is not covered, whether it's monetary, fiscal, macroprudential, any macroeconomic policies and institutions. That's what's missing in regular macroeconomic courses. I'm totally convinced. I know the value of institutions and how institutions take a lot of effort to build, and how easy, from my native country's experience, I can tell you, and you know that, how easy it is to demolish them one after the other, whether they're economic or legal, whatever institutions. It was done in the 1940s, when the Soviets took over Hungary, and it's done again now internally through an autocratic government. So I mean, it's close to that. And what is happening in the US over the last 4 years is actually a testament also of how institutions, which are of course robust, can be weakened deliberately by the head of the government, the head of state. Anyway, so what I really said, from this end, is that the Constitution, having the rules enshrined in a Constitution, is not really critical, because you can find countries where they take it extremely seriously, the rule, and it's just a government commitment. And the right-center government, takes the commitment, or a left of center, and it's continued beyond electoral cycles as the pendulum swings from left to right, okay? And this is really the experience of countries like, again, mentioning Sweden, Chile, Estonia, where there's commitment. And then there are other countries where you wonder about the commitment, even the understanding of what's in the Constitution. I really was amazed when overnight, in a matter of a weekend or whatever, Spain, Austria, Italy, they just introduced, the fiscal rules as a constitutional amendment. And I really doubt, and this was by qualified majorities, 2/3 majorities of parliament and so forth, and I really doubt that even a small fraction of legislators knew what they were voting for, okay? So I rest my case. My problem is just by saying, oh yeah, it's a constitution, no problem. It's sacred. It's not going, it's going to be followed. It's not, okay? So that was, and it's a minor point. It's not a big, I don't mean to make a big deal out of it at all. The commitment is what's necessary. And then of course, some formalization, whatever the DNA or the genetics of a particular society, has actually. On the fiscal space, the index of fiscal space is not really a rule, by the way. There's nothing, it's like a thermometer. And it's a very useful way of showing retrospectively and then prospectively, to the best of our abilities, to show how difficult it will be, or increasingly difficult, to meet a rule. Like in France, Italy, as you very well know, from where you are sitting, you know that it comes to practically a negotiation of, okay, let's do a little fixing here, a little fixing there, and then we are going to forecast a 2.9% of GDP deficit for next year. This happened in Italy about 2 years ago. And it was pretty much accepted by the commission, which is of course a political commission. And in France, you know, they do a little bit here, a little bit there, and it's all, but basically what they're doing is they are demonstrating that there is no fiscal space for implementing rules. And then they try to do a forecast over 5 years of whatever their major, you know, in the stability programs, but with no beef. I mean, they know, and there is no distinction between what is mandatory given by laws which determine social security, etc., the tax system, the laws that cannot be changed by a finance minister or a government from 1 year to the next or within the given budget, okay? They would have to do reforms to really produce the space necessary to comply with the rule, and of course to conduct what we want is a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, which typically is then somehow eroded. So that's the only point about fiscal space. It's a different perspective, and it's much simpler than what the fund is trying to do with this assessment of fiscal space, taking into account, you know, what other countries, the experience about whatever, and then they leave. Is there access to markets? You know, what is the risk premium that they pay? And depending on that, they say, well, there is, or there might not be fiscal space, but there's no measure of it as such. And this is a simple thing. I mean, it's not, and it cannot be even prospectively. You know what the laws are going to be. You know, you have forecasts of the demographics of the, and some, of course, projection of output, of you know, capacity, of interest rates, growth rates. I mean, you just mentioned the interest rate difference with growth rates as being favorable. Well, that would show up, of course, no problem. Okay.
George,
that's all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Maria Manuel, please, your reaction.
Just a brief comment on the budgeting method. Well, of course, there are different methods of preparing the budget. I just mentioned this polar case of the zero-based budget, which opposes to the current incrementalist method. But we have in between several ways to do that, the program budgeting, performing budget, and so on. But the fact that it was difficult to implement the zero-based budget in Portugal, I think it doesn't mean necessarily that we should abandon that idea. We probably should discuss it again and see why was it difficult to implement, because we should aim at the most efficient way of preparing the budget. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Manuel. Thank you. We are a bit late, so I'm going to shorten the interval, but we'll have an interval. So please, we'll have 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes, okay? 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to listen to Paul de Grove and Álvaro Aguiar, okay?
Good afternoon to you all. Welcome back to the second part of this webinar that will start with a panel with a question. New rules for a new era. To answer this question, we have two distinguished speakers, Professor Paul de Grove and Professor Álvaro Aguiar, that I will present now shortly. Professor Paul de Grove is CFP's Vice President, is John Paulson Professor in European Political Economy at the London School of Economics. He is also a Research Fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels and at Center for Economic Policy Research in London. His research activity focuses on international monetary economics, monetary integration, exchange rate economics, and open economy macroeconomics. Then we have Professor Álvaro Aguiar, who is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Porto, where he specializes in the fields of macroeconomics, economic growth and economic policy, and is currently president of the scientific group of economics. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of South Carolina and an equivalent doctoral degree from the University of Porto. So Professor Paul de Grove, please be my guest.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you and to be able to participate in this conference, which is extremely interesting and also discusses important issues that we all face. I also would like to share a screen, if I may do that. Okay, so what I want to do is the following. I want to ask the question first, which is a very basic one. Why fiscal rules in a monetary union, right? Why is that important? Is it important? Then I will follow up with, let's get rid of crazy rules, a little bit the follow-up of Charles. And then I will turn to what rules for the future, and I will conclude with some observations about the new regime, which is characterized by this R smaller than G, and what it implies for debt sustainability. So let me go on. Why fiscal rules in a monetary union? The traditional argument that we have been hearing right from the start was essentially based on the common pool argument, right? There was a common pool there, and if everybody starts fishing in there, there will be overfishing. And typically in a monetary union, all these member states now have access to much larger capital markets, and therefore they will overuse it. In addition, when there is when the credibility of no bailout constraints that are put in the treaty cannot be ensured, right? We have learned that you cannot ensure credibility of no bailout constraint. And so this reasoning has prevailed and has led us to introduce these rules, Stability and Growth Pact, Fiscal Compact, and then we now are in a situation where we find out that this is not workable, right? As Charles has made very clear. But one thing that has not been put forward in this whole analysis of why fiscal rules for monetary union is another feature of a monetary union, which is that member countries and the governments of these member countries cannot monetize the deficits, right? Because they don't have their own central bank. And as a result, that hardens the budget constraint of member countries' governments, right? They have no immediate access to monetization. And as a result, their budget constraint comes as being harder. And that gives them less opportunities and incentives to create excessive debts and deficits. So when you add it all up, then it's not clear why we should conclude that in a monetary union, we have to do something special. We have to impose member countries to fiscal rules that we do not apply to other countries. Standalone countries typically don't have these rules, but we have been convinced that for a monetary union, this is important. So in other words, theoretically, there is no reason why we should do that. So it's an empirical issue, which one of the two mechanisms or dynamics, the common pool dynamics or the no-monetization dynamics, is the tighter one, right? And here, let me show you this little graph. Of course, it will not convince you. It's not really empirically a determining thing to do. But what I put here is the debt to GDP ratio in the Eurozone, the average debt to the GDP ratio in the Eurozone. From the start until 2019, I didn't add the 2020 spike that you saw with Charles' graph, right? But it wouldn't really change the argument that I'm making here. So what is striking is, in fact, that although the Eurozone countries started on average with the highest debt to GDP ratio, in 2019, they now had a debt to GDP ratio that was marginally lower than the UK. In other words, in the UK and the US, the debt to GDP ratio has increased faster. Now, of course, I'm aware that this is not definitive empirical evidence, but it seems to suggest that there might be things there, in particular the no monetization constraint, that disciplines member countries of a monetary union, right? Something that is not present in other monetary setups, and in particular in standalone countries. Now, let's get rid of crazy rules. That was also Charles' analysis, right? The 3 and the 60 lack any intelligent basis, and therefore will be discarded by intelligent people, including politicians, when they are under pressure. And that's what has happened, right? Nobody will, I mean, if you are politically under pressure, and so say the president of France is under political pressure, something has happened, a deep recession or what have you, and then he says, it comes on television, I'm so sorry, I cannot help you, dear Frenchman, because there is this number 3 there. This, you know, forces me to do these things. Now, right, this doesn't make sense, right? This is crazy. That's why I call these crazy rules, right? They will not happen. Let me add something about the structural balance rule, because I will come back to that later. I think the structural balance rule is equally crazy, but for other reasons. I mean, it looks more scientific, right, than the 3 and the 60, right? Because that is obviously crazy. The structural balance rule is not obviously crazy, but I think it is, right? And the reason is that we just don't know how to compute potential output, which is the key element in getting there, right? And the reason is that a satisfactory computation of the potential output requires information about the future, right? Because each time we want to compute the potential output, we actually first look at the past, but we find changes all the time. We think it is structural, but we will only know that these changes are structural in the future, right? We don't know it today. And as a result, we have to revise almost every year these numbers, and which periodically or chronically produces wrong policy advice, right? So so that doesn't make sense to use such rules. In addition, the structural balance rule is a dangerous one because it forbids new debt issue over the business cycle, and as a result, it makes it impossible to finance public investment by that issue, right? And this is not what we should do. This is really, we are harming ourselves in doing this, because it really, there is a huge need for public investment, right? And this has become clear the last decade, right? We need it for environmental reasons. We need it for many other reasons. And such a rule makes it more difficult because it creates wrong political incentives against public investment. Why is that? Well, the benefits of public investments are mainly for future voters, also for present voters, but mainly for future voters, right? While under such a rule, you have to find current revenues or reduce current spendings to make it possible. And as a result, the whole of the cost of something that will have benefits in the future is actually imposed on present voters. And politicians, most politicians will not want to do that, right? They just don't want to do that. And it's quite clear why they don't want to do that. They will be punished by the voters. And as a result, there is an incentive against public investment. And we have seen it, right? The public investments have gone down as a percent of GDP. In many countries in the Eurozone now, the net public investments have been negative for many years, right? So in other words, the public domain, the public capital is deteriorating, is going down. And that's not something we should do. And so we should get rid of this structural balance rule because it is dangerous for our future. And we should switch to a golden rule, which allows public investment to be financed by public debt. Okay. Yeah, the new fad in the last few years has been expenditure rules. But here I would say we face similar problems as the structural budget rule in that we need to estimate a potential or sustainable level of expenditure, but that creates the same problems as computing potential output. So I don't think that's something we should do. What rules for the future then? That's the point that I now want to address, and I'm very much impressed by the work of Charles there. So I very much follow him, but I will make an exception, which already comes from my previous discussion about the golden rule. So I very much follow Charles. We will have to eliminate crazy numbers. Rules shall be formulated and implemented at the national level, right? And I will come back to that and add an additional argument why that is important to do it back from the top-down level to the national level. And this involves setting a long-term target level for government debt to GDP ratio and using the budget balance as the instrument to achieve that, right? And then also gives a special role of independent fiscal councils in formulating the acceptable paths to that given long-term debt. I have similar reservations about putting all this in the Constitution as George formulated. I'm also from a country where I have seen that constitutions can be changed by every new government, right? In fact, every new government in Belgium, almost every new government in Belgium has a program to change the constitution. So I'm a little bit skeptical about it, but this may be my bias coming from Belgium. In other countries, it may be different. So I don't want to say, I don't want to be dogmatic about this. But what I want to do is to add an argument of why the action should be at the national level. And then second, I will want to make an exception with the use of a balanced budget as the instrument to get to the long-term target. So here's the why at the national level. Well, here's the main reasoning, right? Today, decisions about fiscal policy and budgets are at the core of democracies, right? No taxation without representation. This was the call in the 18th century already, right? No taxation without representation, right? And these budgetary decisions are still mostly made at the level of nation states because ultimately that's where sovereignty is still vested. And that's also where today democratic legitimacy is vested, which implies that national politicians are the ones who pay the political price of their budgetary decisions, right? And when you then have a system, a governance system where top down in the name of the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact, you interfere in this democratic decision-making process, you will be in trouble because the European institutions that do that actually do not pay the political price of budgetary decisions. And think of what happened in 2003, 2004. France and Germany were under pressure because of a recession, right? They were responsible among their electorate for the outcome. And then you had this SGP mechanism that wanted to tell the French government and the German government, please do something else, right? And these institutions that tried to force the French and the German government didn't pay the price of this, of what they did. It was the French and the German government that paid the price. And I said, no way, no way. So this governance model is unsustainable and it has been rejected and will continue to be rejected. So that's why I fully share Charles, who has been arguing that for a long time, to bring it back at the national level, right? I think that's the right thing to do. But then where I differ with Charles is to use the balanced budget as the instrument to get to your long-term target, right? I've given the reasons earlier when I criticized the structural budget balance. I think we should not use, there is no reason why the budget should be balanced, right? There is absolutely no reason why that should be. If you take the reasoning that I've given and the need to have a golden rule allowing public investment to be financed by debt. Right? So that I think is a key. And therefore, we should use something like the current budget as the instrument to achieve a balanced rule. I look at, in practice, it may not make that much difference, you know, because typically the capital budget in the golden rule would be what, 2 or 3% of GDP, which means that the current budget is like 97, 98% of GDP. So in terms of masses, it's still the overriding part of the budget. Okay, to conclude then, just a few thoughts about sustainability of government debt when R is smaller than G, the present interest rate regime that we are in, right? And I did the following little exercise. So here it is. I looked at 30-year bond yields of a number of countries: Italy, Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal. And then, so I did just a very simple simulation, start at 100, right? And assume that today you generate 100 of debt, whatever you call it, it's just an index, right? It's a percent of GDP. And then you finance this by issuing of 30-year bonds with an interest rate that you see there on the right-hand side, right? And then you can make assumptions about nominal growth for the next 30 years and assume that the nominal growth could be something like 3%, inflation 2%, real growth 1%. And then you can see the power of that regime, which is that these bonds that are issued today, right, over 30 years in some countries will be, as a weight of GDP, will be less than 50%, huh? Like in Germany, France, Belgium, Portugal is also like a little bit more than 50%. So huge advantages of sustainability. If you issue that debt today, well, over the 30, that looks like it's going to be quite sustainable, right? If we add that today, well, that looks like for the next 30 years, this will be quite sustainable. So also this assumes that the primary balance is in equilibrium, right? So there's a zero primary balance, which means that the budget balance will show a deficit throughout, because you finance the interest by issuing new debt, right? But of course, interest rate is very low, so therefore this budget deficit that you have along this path is also relatively low. Now you can make other assumptions, say, for example, 2% nominal growth rate, then you still have less pronounced, of course, but still significant declines, right? This seems to me to be a reasonable assumption. This is average over a 30-year period. Certainly, that is certainly below what we have seen in the previous 30 years, right? You can even go to 1%, then Italy is in trouble, right? Because there, Italy still has to pay interest over a longer, above 1%. Okay, let me conclude. Of course, I agree with Charles that we don't know how long this new regime will last, right? So we have to be careful about these things. But at least we have now the capacity to lock in this new regime for a number of years. I would argue probably for 10 years, right? Because given the average duration of the debt, which may be something like 7 or 8%, and assuming that this regime will last for a couple of years, we can actually lock in this new regime for something like 10 years, maybe even more, which changes the horizon, at least for the next 10 years, and makes it much more attractive to think about the future. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Álvaro Guiar?
Yes.
Please.
Let me capture. So the PowerPoint is just just an outline so that I won't get lost. I want to thank the FEP and the Conselho das Finanças Públicas for organizing this very interesting session, and for inviting me to participate in it. I've been learning quite a lot. It's been very interesting. It's a shame that we couldn't use the coffee break or the break to engage in conversations with some people that it would be interesting too, but that's okay. I mean, this is not perfect. So new rules for a new era. I want to talk a little bit about new era and new fiscal rules. I'm not going to talk a lot about, because I think that many of the speakers today, many of the participants today have talked about it. But I want to finish by talking a little bit about new governance, which is not in the title, but I think it comes with the rules, of course. Yes, I think there will be a new era after the COVID crisis concerning many things, and certainly fiscal sovereignty and sovereign debt. Okay, so there will be a new era. We have, in general, of course, we don't know yet, but there are some temporary measures that are in place and that will be in place for a while. I don't know how many of these measures, or in what extent some of these measures will mean really a new level of government intervention in the economy, or if they are really temporary, because we are right now we see an unprecedented support of incomes, businesses, and not just the banking sector, but entire sectors of the economy under a very severe intervention by the governments in many aspects. We like to think that this is going to be temporary. I'm not sure that everything will be temporary. So we may be up to a new level of structural size of the government. Let's see. In any case, of course, we'll have for a while we'll mostly likely have an increase in health expenditures, and that's more public expenditure, more public debt. There are some positive sides. Maybe we'll have an increase in the tax base in the medium run, and because we'll have less tax evasion, and maybe if this crisis means a quicker transition to a digital economy, maybe we'll have an increase in potential output. That some good news may come from there. Well, let's hope. And of course, this is supposing that we will not have another global financial crisis, that protectionist trends are going to be reversed, and so that things go well, let's say, with the other aspects of the economy and of the society at large. Now, in particular, in the euro area, we see a large increase. We have seen already today in the figures, and we'll see even more, a large increase in public debt ratios, not only of individual countries, but also of the euro area itself as a whole, and also of the European institutions, various European institutions that are going to engage in debt issuance if the programs for recovery are going to be in place. So a large increase in debt, there's no doubt about it. That's in itself, it's a big in itself is a new era in terms of fiscal and sovereign debt. And also there is also an aspect that has not been very much mentioned here, but we will also have in the crisis and in the after crisis a large increase in the ECB balance, the ECB holdings of sovereign debt of member countries of the European Union, and of course in particular of the euro area. And this will probably last for some prolonged time. It depends how this thing will be, and how the ECB will unwind the ECB, and the countries, of course, will unwind the situation. But there is really a very large increase in these balances. These ratios, we have seen some simulations, some very simple simulations here, but it is a fact that even though currently the R minus G difference is very favorable at the moment, the fact is that with the burden of the debt, we know it always takes some time for the ratios to come down come down significantly, and so we will have a prolonged time of the burden of these public debts, of course, and the longer it takes, of course, the longer the danger of unsustainability, for instance, for an increase in interest rates, for a reversal, let's say, of the favorable ratio. Of course, the longer it takes for the ratios to come down, the longer it takes for the danger of unsustainability to be put away, let's say. Okay, so given these new rules, well, at least we have there will be some time where the general escape clause of Stability and Growth Pact will have to be deactivated. It's currently activated. I don't know if it was the 10 years that if he was referring to this, we talked about 10 years time that we have, but at least when that happens, the rules will have to be at least adjusted. I don't know if put away with crazy rules, as Paul Hoff has mentioned or has called, but there will be an opportunity to introduce new, leaner, maybe more effective rules. We heard about it here today, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. But I would also like to stress it's not just the rules. They have to be adapted. They have to be country specific, but also a problem with nice fiscal rules is the distinction between temporary and permanent, and also including distinction between cyclical and the structural. Some new ways will have to be found, or it won't work, right? So in any case, I won't spend much time on this because I want to go directly now to governance. Do we need new governance? Yeah, apparently we do. I mean, we have there is some consensus on that, and today I think it was visible. Although I go the other way, as you will see. In terms of governance, well, the problem is that even if temporarily, for each member state, and we'll have we'll have several member states with very high debt to GDP ratios for a long while, probably. These member states will have a large share of their public expenditure financed by debt issued by European institutions, okay, directly, by the European Commission, through the stability mechanism, and also a very large share of their debt owned by the ECB, or in the balance of the ECB, or in the balances of the central banks of each country. And this is a challenge for me. These two aspects, these very large shares of public expenditure financed by debt issued by European institutions, and the public debt issued by the country being largely owned by the ECB, okay, even though on a rolling basis, but I suspect that will be that will take a time for it to unwind. This will put serious challenges in terms of the governance of fiscal policy and the path for the public debt, because for a highly in debt member state, that, as I said, probably there will be several in the euro area, and the euro area itself maybe. This will imply the large and prolonged loss of debt and budgetary sovereignty. The problem is that this loss of sovereignty, which happens, it goes with the process of economic and financial integration. That's fine, but the problem is that we are losing this sovereignty to the monetary authority. Okay, to the ECB that holds that, and to European authorities that are not, that are, to say the least, perfectly accountable, and certainly not elected, and imperfectly accountable. So we are losing this sovereignty, and we are going to lose I think for a long time, to institutions that are not, that are, of course, very, very respectable, let's say, but not necessarily accountable and democratically accountable, I would say. And I think this will become very easily politically unsustainable in each member states, or in some member states at least. But it will also be very problematic for the own objectives of the European Central Bank, of the Monetary Authority. It is not supposed to be taking care of the debt of each member state, right? So it will be also problematic not only for the member state, for each member state, but also in terms of the sustainability, let's say, of the functioning of both of the Monetary Authority and also of the other European authorities involved here in this process. Okay, so for me this is unsustainable. It increasingly looks like the only virtuous way out is for the member states to lose fiscal sovereignty, including sovereign debt. But yes, but to elected, democratically accountable authorities. So, and this is called a fiscal union. Okay, so I go in the other direction. I'm not sure about this, of course, no one is, but I would suggest thinking also about the other direction. Go into a proper fiscal union. I think this is becoming politically more feasible, especially when compared with the large political governance failure that we are going to have to face in the foreseeable future, if we try to keep with the current status quo, let's say, with current arrangements, which, as I said, both from the point of view of the member states, but also from the point of view of the European institutions, to me, they look increasingly unsustainable. So in face of that, fiscal union looks increasingly politically more feasible, I would say. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Álvaro Aguiar and Professor Paul de Grove. Unfortunately, time management will not allow us to have space for questions. So I will pass the microphone to Professor Carlos Marinheiro, member of the CFP Senior Board. He's also assistant professor at Faculty of Economics from the University of Coimbra and holds a PhD in economics by University of Louvain. Then we'll have some final words by Professor Nazaré da Costa Cabral. That will close the meeting. Thank you.
Am I sharing my screen already? So, good afternoon. When has already introduced me, so I will try to quickly draw some conclusions from this very interesting discussion we have had so far in this conference. We are discussing fiscal rules at a time of a very challenging, very changing and challenged landscape. As was recently Álvaro mentioned it, so the pandemic has led to an increase in public debt in all Euro area member countries. According to the most recent European Commission forecast, the gross public debt is expected to increase by 16 percentage points of GDP in the Euro area from 2019 to the end of 2021. There is, however, a considerable country variation, with increase ranging from just 5 points in the case of Luxembourg to 26, which is being forecasted for Spain. Portugal is somewhere in the middle of these figures with 13 points of GDP. However, such increase in debt, they add to pre-existing pandemic levels of debt that differed much across countries. As a result, we will likely see a huge range of debt to GDP ratios by the end of 2021. The euro area, according to this forecast of the Commission, is expected to surpass 100% of GDP debt ratio. Greece is expected to be around 200% of GDP. Then we have a group of countries like Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium, and Cyprus, with a debt level which is higher than 100% and was higher than 100% before the pandemic. But we have Luxembourg, Estonia, Denmark, Lithuania, which still present a figure which is smaller than the 60% threshold that we have, sorry for that we have in here. And we have a small group of countries which is rounding to around the 60% threshold. This occurs due to a significant drop in GDP, around 8% this year, and with a prolonged and uncertain recovery. According to the more recent forecasts, the euro area is only expected to recover to pre-pandemic GDP level in 2023. At the same time, there was an unprecedented quantitative easing policy, which was pursued by the ECB, the Bank of England, the Fed, and other central banks. And the long-term interest rates are in a descending trend, reaching historically low long-term interest rates, even for high euro area indebted countries. So such low long-term interest rates makes it easier to sustain a higher debt ratio. The question that imposes itself is, for how long will the interest rate stay low? All of this has profound consequences for fiscal policy and for fiscal rules. Stability-backed rules are now suspended until the end of 2021, and they are not likely to be restored exactly as they were before being suspended. As a matter of fact, this year, 2020, was supposed to be the year of consultations regarding the economic governance review, which was launched in February by the European Commission and which was supposed to be concluded here by the end of 2020. In the effectiveness review of the EU fiscal framework, the Commission has identified as areas in need of improvement the persistence of pro-cyclicality in fiscal policies and the persistence of high debt in some countries, the complexity of the EU rules and the consequent lack of political ownership, together with the need to pay more attention to the quality of public finance, especially to protect investment from cuts to deliver fiscal consolidation. This conference has discussed much of such issues. I will try to summarize the main points made by our distinguished speakers. So I have prepared this summary. I hope you can see it. The letter is not very large because I have to put here a large amount of information. I think we have some interesting common trends which were highlighted by our speakers, namely the importance of the national level, the importance of debt as the variable to which we must pay attention to, also the failures of the SGP and European fiscal framework that were very much focused by almost all speakers, and the recognition of the importance of good institutions working at the national and also at supranational level, good data, good communication, the need to simplify the rules and to have them probably at the national level, which also has consequences in terms of economic governance as more generally. So all in all, I think that the experience has shown that it is incredibly difficult to impose uniform fiscal rules to a non-homogeneous group of countries. That attempt has led to complexity, lack of transparency, and to political interpretation of the EU large set of fiscal rules. So we have that rules that apply to all countries have reached very different outcomes, and different results also were seen for the same country over time, as you can clearly see in case of our country, in case of Portugal. This leads me to conclude that the effectiveness and enforcement of the rules are more linked to the political commitment and to proper national fiscal frameworks than to legal dispositions. Consequently, in my personal opinion, I think it is time to consider a more radical alternative, to let the operational rules to be defined at the national level, anchored in proper medium-term budget frameworks, and just retain higher level rules at supranational level. For example, a reform that rule which most our speakers were referring to. Of course, that such an approach has preconditions. It requires effective independent fiscal institutions operating at national level and political commitment to fiscal sustainability as preconditions in order to their effectiveness. So I would like you to thank you for your attention, and on behalf also of this institution to express our gratitude to the Faculty of Economics of the Economy of Porto and our distinguished guests. But I will pass the floor to Nazareth, that probably will give us some final remarks on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos, and also for this excellent conclusion and also observations, final observations. Well, and I don't have many much to say, because there was a lot was said during this session. I think that we had here, this was a very promising session, and we could confirm that it was a very good, a very excellent session, where important ideas were brought about the future design of fiscal rules, whether they should be more on a national or European basis, which kind of variables should be chosen. So I think that the discussion was very, very important, very fruitful. For us, CFP, the observations, the recommendations, the suggestions that all the speakers made were taken into full consideration. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presence here. I would like to thank once again the Faculty of Porto for the way it has welcomed, and Professor José Varejão in particular, as because the way they positively welcomed this initiative. Only to say that the intention of the CFP for the next year is to continue this kind of initiative. We are still discussing in the way we will implement a new cycle of conferences for the next 2021. Of course, the model of conference will be chosen following the evolution of the pandemics, and also the number and the topics that will be addressed will be, of course, decided. We will announce the new cycle of conferences as soon as possible. So thank you once again for your participation, and for those that have attended the conference, thank you for staying here with us. Thank you.